Hey, welcome everybody. I'm Mark Britz, Director of Event Programming at the Guild. We're kicking things off a little bit early because we got a lot of ground to cover today before we turn things over to Shelley and give him ample time to discuss his focus today on understand and implement xAPI profiles. But what I want to do is give a chance for Karen Gleason, our Director of Online Events, to share a little bit more about the upcoming pieces around projects. So I'm going to advance here real quick. Go ahead, Karen.
Thanks, Mark. So, as you probably know, we're have teams within the Slack channel, starting with hashtag team such and such. We have those projects, and people are kind of forming them. There's some there on the screen right there of the ones that have formed so far. Some are still forming, some are start just getting off the ground. That's great. We really want you to have something there where you can have something to show off at the end of cohort, what you've learned. It doesn't have to be a complete project. We're interested in seeing your journey with xAPI so that we can know what you're learning. And Wednesdays, I would love for you to send me a team update, a description of what you're doing and what you have there, what updates you have for the week, what you're going to accomplish, maybe where you're stuck, what help you might need. If you have those kinds of things, like I'm stuck here, post it into the hashtag main. You might be surprised. We have over 6,000 people in the Slack channel, lots of experts. They may be able to help you with that. So I'm going to give you some project team updates at the end, and we have a couple of the teammates who are going to give their couple minute overviews, summaries of what they've been working on. So I hope you join a project. Back to you, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Karen. That's great detail. Everybody, focus on that conversation that's always taking place in Slack. Find those groups, those opportunities. And by the way, just so you're aware, you have an opportunity to share your own xAPI work at our upcoming xAPI party in late April. The CFP will be coming out very soon, so you can submit that. It's a very simple CFP to kind of capture everything Karen was talking about in terms of your journey and be able to share that openly with the entire community here within our xAPI cohort. So again, register for this. It'll be taking place on April 27th. This information, don't worry about memorizing this. We'll be sharing this quite a bit over the next couple of weeks, and especially when we open up the CFP on March 6th. So look for that. A couple of things also to keep in mind is our upcoming Learning Solutions Conference and Expo in Orlando. In addition to the two sessions you see listed here, we also have lots of content related and conversations around xAPI that take place at this event. So again, you have an opportunity to save on registration right now until Friday. Tomorrow is our last big savings of $100 on registration to attend Learning Solutions in Orlando. Big thing to always keep in mind, if you haven't already, become a member of the Guild. This is where you'll get all your communications and connections to the great resources and events that are taking place. Information about even the xAPI cohort takes place there. So as you see by the list on here, the publications, the research that we do, event discounts because you're a member, session recordings available, and a lot more. So do check it out. Check out the website and you'll see a lot more about it. And membership is, of course, free. So now I want to make sure that Shelley has enough time with you today to talk about understand and implement xAPI profiles. Shelley Blake Block is from Yet Analytics. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Shelley. Shelley, just give me 1 minute to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. That seemed to work. And I'm also going to exit the stage and give you all the limelight.
All right. Thanks for having me. Can I just get confirmation that you all can see my slides here? I don't know if anyone can speak or if you can hear me. Are we good?
Yeah, Shelley, we can see your slides.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. Here we go. So today we're going to take a look at xAPI profiles and give you a little bit of background here, just who I am, My name is Shelley Blake Plock, founder at Yet Analytics. We work on xAPI and total learning architecture design and implementations for the US government. And I also work over at the Learning Technology Standards Committee at the LTSC, where I'm an officer. I chair the technical advisory group on xAPI over there, as well as the working group on xAPI cybersecurity. So I've got some background related to xAPI. But before we even get into the profiles, to understand sort of the value of profiles, I want to talk about it in terms of what's called the total learning architecture. So the total learning architecture is a project that has come out of the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative, which is the same organization that developed xAPI. And the view is basically this. On the screen now, this is what the world currently looks like, and where we would like it to go is a world that is much more centered around data, where data becomes a hub for all activity in the learning and training space. And so they've developed what they call the total learning architecture, which essentially consists of several pillars. On the first side, you have xAPI. So xAPI itself is semantic data. It describes activity. xAPI profiles, you can think about the difference is that where xAPI describes activity, xAPI profiles creates sequences and patterns of those activity to define experience. And xAPI profiles are used to automate interoperation within the TLA and ensure accessibility across TLA systems. So an example is a project at the US Army called SteelR. It's been widely published over the last 2 years. And there, the idea is, I'm going to start with number one here. There are synthetic training applications that push data out. That data, a portion of it, here at number three, is monitored and managed by an intelligent tutor called GIFT. GIFT emits xAPI statements and is governed by an xAPI profile. The data that comes out of GIFT lands in what's called a noisy LRS. So in the total learning architecture, you don't have one monolithic LRS where everything goes. Rather, LRSs are federated. And so you can have as many noisy LRSs as you need towards the edge of your computing architecture. And on those noisy LRSs, we put what are called profile filters, where we use xAPI profiles to define business logic so that we can send particular types of data downstream for business purposes. So this data is filtered. It lands in what we call a transactional layer. And from there, in this case, we push competencies and dashboards. So this is an example of using xAPI profiles to govern the business logic of data within a learning and training ecosystem. And we can extrapolate that into thinking about it in terms of different things. So apps, sims, databases, same thing, pushing data through as xAPI. It goes through your noisy LRSs and is filtered. That data lands in a transactional layer where it's used by business systems. That can include competencies and dashboards, but can also include business microservices that relate to information such as compliance, readiness, and workforce planning. The data can also be used to train ML models and then push AI-enabled learning analytics back into the system. So we had an engagement with the Air Force where we built out a platform that followed this model. And basically what happens is you have a platform for gaining access to learning events. That platform pushes the data as xAPI into a validation layer. That validation layer is then governed by an xAPI profile that controls the business logic in how the xAPI is going to be sent down through the system. That xAPI data that's filtered lands in a transactional layer. From that transactional layer, there is a series of data that's pushed to automated reporting and data visualization, and another set that's pushed into AI recommender processes that feed back into the learning portal. So the short story is that xAPI profiles themselves are of many types. You have general profiles, such as you may have heard of CMI5 for learning management systems. You can have common activity typologies, like a video profile or an audio profile. You can also have specific profiles. These can be domain-based, such as for pilot training versus for combat medic training, or pedagogical or andragogical strategies, instructional approaches, such as a profile to model project-based instruction versus peer assessment versus AI mentored. And then business filtering. And at ADL, they've published a profile called the Master Object Model, which is a master profile typology for the total learning architecture for business systems. So the data is input, validated, it's used as evidence, and it provides summation of what happened in the form of auditable and interoperable records. So when we put that all together, we have our data sources that push xAPI. We have data features that are going to validate, store, and provide access to the xAPI. We have business systems that are going to consume and use the xAPI. And then we have record-keeping systems that are going to enable things like credentials, badges, certifications, etc. All of this is connected. The big takeaway here, and why I wanted to start with this first, is that in addition to improving the fidelity of xAPI data in general implementations, the xAPI profile itself is the method for modeling data flow in the TLA. So for a lot of people, when they first encounter xAPI profiles, they think about it as like a verb registry. It's a list of verbs that I'm going to use to define what I'm talking about. And while that's part of it, it actually, as we're about to see, goes a lot deeper. So this is all part of a standard activity portfolio at the IEEE. The xAPI profiles standard itself will go into voting and balloting late this year. And this portfolio provides all of the data standards that support the total learning architecture. So xAPI profiles is one of the core standards in this portfolio. So what do you need to know? Here we go. So what we're going to learn over the next 35 minutes or so, we'll do a review of xAPI statements. We'll look at the xAPI profile components. We'll look at the xAPI data design structure. And then what you will be able to do afterwards is build a conformant xAPI profile component by component. I would strongly suggest that the way that you use this information is in this initial session, just listen and follow through with me the best that you can, and then go back and take the video and work from there. Because there is a lot of information here. But in the slides, I've presented more information than I'll actually go through. So you'll have lots and lots and lots of stuff to go through in the end. Okay, so xAPI statements themselves are a record of any experience that's tracked in xAPI. It's written in JSON format, and we can align xAPI data to xAPI profiles. So we've all seen this actor, verb, object format, right? And we know that each individual xAPI statement has a unique ID. Now, the xAPI statement anatomy, if we break it up, we have an actor that performs the action, the verbs, which are unique identifiers that say what's happening, and the objects representing the target of the action. In xAPI and in RDF more broadly, verbs have to be active verbs, right? We don't use passive verbs. And objects have to be direct objects. We don't use indirect objects. So it's always about someone doing something and it's being done to something. So actor, verb, object. Now, When we take the leap from designing xAPI statements to xAPI profiles, we begin by collecting all of the potential recordable events in plain text. Just write down a list of all the things that you're going to record. I'll show you an example of this. Next, you're going to take each action and think about how that action recorded during the scenario is going to become an xAPI statement. And in this process, really what we want you to think about are the questions that you would like answered from the data, right? Because you can collect as much data as you want, but junk data in, junk answers out. What we want you to do is really think about, what am I trying to answer with the data? And then sort of design backwards and say, this is the type of things that I'll need to collect in order to answer those questions, or in order to enable these really cool processes. So start by defining your use case. For our conversation here, local coffee shop has onboarding training, hiring a new team, and we're going to go, we're setting up an xAPI profile that will assess the new hire's current skill level when it comes to making a pot of coffee. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So the who are the new hires being onboarded? What learning activities are going to be recorded? And what is the goal of collecting the learning activities in xAPI? Anytime I design a profile, this is how I start: who, what, and why. Now, let's start with the actor. So the actor is going to be doing all these activities. So when I make a pot of coffee, what am I doing? I start my coffee making assessment. I lift the lid, I remove the old filter, I replace it, I pour coffee beans into the grinder and ground the coffee beans. I pour the coffee grounds into the filter. I lift the coffee pot and fill it with water. I pour the water into the machine, close the lid, start the coffee machine, lift the coffee cup, pour coffee into the cup, and drink my coffee. I'm done. Okay. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about just write out what actually happens during the event in a simple scenario. So the verb, the actor ground the coffee beans, right? So in an xAPI statement, I'll see that here, Shelly, I'll use an example. Shelly ground coffee beans. Okay. So the object is the coffee beans, and that's the activity that is this thing that's being acted upon. So the agent or group represents who can perform actions. Statement reference indicates the action that if it applies to a previously recorded event, and a substatement does the same thing, but within a statement. So they're a little bit tricky, but statement reference basically says, I can't pour the coffee until I've put it, I've let the water drip into the coffee pot. So there are references. Certain things have to happen in a certain sequence for things to be done properly. So when it comes to down to the brass tacks, I start with my verbs. Here are all those verbs that we just went through. And here are all of the objects that I'm going to use in my making coffee. Now that we've got the basic information, we can start to actually build this thing. Use the xAPI profile spec to guide as a resource. It's there, it's open source, it's available to you. But let's break it down. Okay, so we said Shelly ground, right? The actor Shelly and the verb ground describes what the agent is doing and the action being taken. The actor can be an agent or a group. So here it's Shelly. It could be a team, but let's just say it's Shelly. In green, the context activities describes two things: parent and category. The parent shows that this first series is the overarching training session. Okay, we're talking about assessing the ability to grind and make coffee. The second one shows you the type of training that is taking place. So we have overall, it's an assessment. And what is the assessment about? It's about making coffee. Okay. The object is coffee beans, okay? And I have two activity definition extensions, and they're going to tell me the type of roast of bean and the amount of coffee bean. So all of this I can put into my statement. Then I have a result. Okay, so I've gone through here actor, verb, object, and now my result. The result is my roast is going to be dark roast, and my grind size, how much am I grinding those beans? It's going to be coarse. Okay, and so the result begins with an extension for the grind size, records the success, completion, and response from the instructor. So the instructor can say, nope, you didn't do it correctly. You completed the task, but it wasn't done correctly because the response that the instructor gave is that the grounds were too coarse. It took you this long to do it, but you're going to have to do it again. Okay. Now, within the result extension itself, it allows for the recording of event outcomes, right? So we saw that it was ground too coarse. So within this extension, I'm able to give more information about why the result was what it was. And then the context. This gets tricky. So all eyes on me. So context activities contain parent, category, grouping, other properties that can be used. As we sort of just saw, there are 4 types of context activities: grouping, parent, other, and category. So grouping activities, parent activities, other types of activities, or activities which fit into a particular type of category. Additionally, within context activities, you can capture things like the registration. So you know that it's associated, for example, with a course that came out of a certain LMS, the instructor and the team, who they were, the platform, say that you have this running on an LXP, you know which platform it comes from, and the language, what language it was delivered in. All of this is within the context of an xAPI profile. So the context API itself will tell us the registration, information related to the grouping, other that does not fit one of the properties, and so the short story is that the profile components themselves come down to actor, verb, activity, extension. So when we talk about xAPI statements, we're talking about actor, verb, object. When we're talking about statement templates within xAPI profiles, we're talking about the actor, and then the verb, activity, and the extensions are summed together and called concepts. So verbs, activity types, attachment usage types, extensions, profile resources, all that stuff, that makes up your concepts. Okay. The concepts make up statement templates. Statement templates make up patterns, and patterns can be used to make a primary pattern, and we'll see why that's important. But just to sort of refresh there, verb, activity, and the extensions, this is what we call a concept in an xAPI profile. Concepts can be put together, multiple concepts, to create statement templates. Multiple statement templates can be put together to create patterns, and different patterns can be organized to create primary and other patterns. So when it comes down to the brass tacks, all of the verbs and objects collected at the beginning will become concepts in the xAPI profile. So when I grind coffee in the machine, ground is my verb. I grounded coffee. The grinder is the activity context. Where was the coffee ground? It was ground in the grinder, as opposed to, for example, doing it by hand. If I did it by hand, that would be a different activity context. So you can see that I can really get extraordinarily granular in the way that I model out my learning experience as data. Okay, so here we go. Profile components, top level priorities, properties rather. We have our ID and when the timestamp occurs. We have a what's called a revision of if it follows prior versions of a profile. There is no standard structure for naming the ID within a profile, but it should be URL. And then semantic versioning is recommended so that, the expectation is that profiles will be iterative and over time will make changes. So it's always a good idea here where you see under the ID to put like version 1 versus version 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay. Concepts. The concepts must have unique IRIs or unique identifiers themselves. Okay, and those concepts are our building blocks: verb, activity, and extension. So when we say Shelley ground coffee beans, the verb ground is its own concept in a profile. So you have to sort of train yourself off of thinking about ground within the active verb object of an xAPI statement and think about ground as a concept within an xAPI profile. And this shows what that looks like. So ground in red is a type of concept, and the type is a verb. Coffee beans, likewise, is a type of concept within the profile, and that type is an activity. We can add concepts for the activity of coffee beans, right? Here are beans. This is an activity type, right? And then there are additional concepts that can be added that think about this as like advanced xAPI profiles, but the use of attachments, extensions, different profile resources, etc. This is all like advanced once you've mastered the basics. So the statement templates, I would argue, are kind of the most important part of the xAPI profiles, and in some ways are the easiest to get your head around. So they define the way that the statements can be built. So the statement template fields place restrictions on what data can be found within a statement. All right, so we've already got this idea that within a statement template, we're going to have an actor, and then we're going to have this triple of concepts, which can get bigger in an advanced version. But for basics, I've got 3: verb, activity, and extension. Every single possible combination within my activity becomes a statement template within my profile. So, for example, if I'm going to add a statement for grinding coffee beans, I'm going to say, here's my statement template. Ground is my verb. Coffee beans is my object type. And then I see this down here in my narrative. I lifted the machine, removed the old coffee, replaced it. Down here, I poured ground coffee beans into the new filter. Okay. So the ground coffee beans, right? The combination of the verb and the coffee beans into a template that says that these are beans that have been ground by Shelley, that occurs in the prior statement. So in the prior statement, Shelley ground the coffee beans. Now that those coffee beans are ground, we have the concept, right? These are concepts. We have the concept of ground coffee beans. This is what you have to think about as you're building a profile, that the sequence of events have logical conclusions to them, and there are changes that are affected in some sort of outcome, such as before and after the beans are ground, that change the concept of what the beans represent. So creating the grinding beans statement template, this is what it would actually look like to do it. We start with the ID, right? And we say this is a statement template about grinding beans. And what we're going to say is that the beans, in order to be considered in the template grinding beans, the beans are ground, they're beans, and then we can include our other info, right? We can say what grind size they are, because if they're ground, they're going to be ground to a certain size. So we can say that within our profile. That's considered what's called an extension. And there are three types of basic extensions in xAPI profiles. There's a context extension. This would say, what is the amount of the grounds that were roasted, right? We have a result extension. When the beans were ground, what size were they ground to? Or how long did it take to ground them? And we have an activity extension. What kind of coffee bean, right? People who are better than me at coffee know that there's all different types of beans. So each type of bean could be its own individual extension. And maybe there's a slightly different process for working with one type of coffee bean versus optimally working with another type of coffee bean. So these context extensions can be used to further describe the xAPI statements. So for our example statement, we have in the context, so ground amount, 2 scoops, okay? In the profile, we have ground amount. Ground amount is going to be a context extension, and it's going to tell us about it. So we're going to say that these are roast beans. It defines that these are ground beans, and we're going to say in the example statement, these are 2 scoops of ground beans. The result extension, I can say that when we ground the beans, right, what was the result? The result was that they were ground coarse. So if coarse was what I was going for, I succeeded. If I was supposed to grind these to be fine and they came out coarse, then I did not succeed. And then in the activity extension, we have for example, the brand of roast. So this is everyone's favorite Yeti Dark Roast. And the brand Yeti Dark Roast is an activity extension. Okay, so what kind of ground beans are these? These are Yeti Dark Roast ground beans, and they have been ground to be coarse because that's what we wanted to do. So there are also statement template rules. So these are going to restrict values in the statement to help you set up more parameters. And they basically will say, okay, so given what data you're going to be collecting in a given profile, this is data that must be in the profile. This is data that should be in the profile. This is data that should not be in the profile. Any, the word any, is used to indicate that any of the items can be found. All is used to indicate that all of them should be found. None means that none of them should be found. All right? Further statement template rules. In the JSON itself, in the code, there will be a string that shows where the restriction applies. All this means to us is we're saying specifically what object should have all, any, or none, right? So in this case, we're saying that the activity of a coffee filter, right? Any coffee filter will do, all right? So we're not saying that it has to be like a particular filter or a particular size. We're just saying, let's do this quick, just coffee filter, all right? So that is a rule that we can apply there. Now, the second sort of big part, the third big part of xAPI profiles are patterns. And patterns are in some ways the trickiest, but they're extraordinarily valuable. And it could be argued that you don't really have an xAPI profile if you do not have at least one primary pattern that is elaborated in the profile itself. So let's talk about what that means. So patterns are used to describe collections of statements, okay? So remember, we had the statements are comprised of the concepts, and we turn the concepts into statement templates. We use those statement templates to organize them together as collections that we call patterns. And depending where we put the statements, it changes the pattern. So, number one, statement template determines if an xAPI statement is relevant. And what that means is if we have a pattern that says the learner has to do X, Y, and Z in that order, and we get a statement that says the learner did W, that statement's not relevant, so we don't consider it. It's outside the pattern. We also have patterns that establish how the patterns themselves relate to one another. So maybe I have one pattern that says, this is how I work the coffee machine, and I have another pattern that says, this is what, this is my demeanor in talking with customers as I'm working the coffee machine. They're going to be two different patterns, but they can relate to one another. And in order to be successful in my assessment, I have to both make the coffee correctly, and I have to use the proper protocol in talking with customers. So the patterns. There are 5 basic types of patterns. Either a sequence where first A, then B, an alternate, either A or B, optional, maybe A, one or more, at least one A, or 0 or more, possibly at least one A. So when we create patterns, these are the 5 logical sequences that we are trying to represent. So in a primary pattern, this represents the classification options for the way that we collect the xAPI statements. So my collection matches primary A, it does not match primary B, right? So in my primary patterns, I can see that I correctly hit all of the xAPI statements necessary to get primary pattern A. Why is this important? At this point, you should be asking yourself, Shelley, you're telling me all this stuff, but why does this matter? I'll tell you why it matters. In what is represented in that little box right there, the fact that we can collect the statements according to concepts, create templates of those concepts, and then patterns of those concepts, and mark the patterns that they either work or don't work, that is exactly how you get from activity occurring within a learning experience to the assertion of competency. That's how it happens. A primary pattern can say that the actor went through this statement template, this statement template, this statement template, right? There's a pattern to it. There can be a second optional pattern. Perhaps we want to see how someone works in a different environment or under duress or with stress and difficulty. So we create different patterns to assess those things against the typical pattern. So there are different types of patterns. The sequence pattern. This is your 2 or more. So Shelley poured coffee beans into the grinder, ground the coffee beans in the grinder, poured the coffee beans into the filter. All right. So this is in order what occurred. It's a sequence. I pour stuff in the grinder, I grind it, and I pour it into the filter. And this is what it looks like. It says I have a pattern and I have a sequence. I poured beans, I ground beans, I poured grounds, right? So we have the types of statements that would result from a sequence pattern, right? Here we have Shelley poured the coffee beans into the grinder. Shelley ground the coffee beans. Shelley poured the coffee beans that are ground into the filter. Okay, that's a sequence. We have alternate patterns, right? So in this case, Shelley added syrup to the coffee cup, and Shelley added sugar to the coffee cup. Okay, they are not necessary by the primary pattern, but they are things that I can do and we can record. So there we would say, in order to make caramel coffee, the pattern is that I added whipped cream and I added syrup in that order. So the statements there say Shelley added caramel syrup, Shelley added sugar, Shelley added all of the things in order to make that custom drink. There's an optional pattern. The optional pattern says Shelley added ice to the coffee, right? So likewise, iced coffee, pattern, added ice. You can see that these patterns are, if we take the example of coffee, I can create different coffee drinks. I can do it hot or cold. I can serve it in different size cups, different types of cups versus a mug. All of those could be modeled as different patterns. All right, so that's the short story there on patterns and why they're important. And that primary pattern, the pattern that you have to have in your profile, says, okay, this was coffee training, right? This is my primary pattern. You start, and then there's a pattern for your coffee machine, French press, iced coffee, whatever set of statement templates you have for that activity, you've got in a pattern. Before going on to the demo, I wanted to thank my colleague Amanda Keibler for her work on the design of the tutorial assets in this presentation. She did a killer job. All right, so what I wanted to show you over here is where we can actually look at what these profiles actually look like. So I'll go in here. I have a profile in coffee training. And you see that in my profile, I have templates, patterns, and concepts. Okay. So I'll start with templates. And the templates themselves, here I'm going to pour coffee beans. So I have a template for pouring coffee beans. The simple value is that I pour the coffee beans, right? And then I have a definition for what that means. And then I have the JSON, which tells me that I've poured coffee beans, right? And it uses the verb pour. It uses the activity type coffee beans. It's using this is a statement template type for pouring coffee beans. Also, in the same way that an LRS serves the purpose of validating xAPI profiles, you also want to be able to validate your xAPI, an LRS validates xAPI statements. You also want to be able to validate xAPI profiles. So here, for instance, this is all live validation. So as I break something here, it's going to tell me what that I have an error and where it is and what's going on. And then I fix it and we're all good. It's important because you always want to deal with valid xAPI profiles in the exact same way that you always want to deal with valid xAPI statements. So then we move over to patterns. And in the patterns, we say an optional pattern for adding sugar, right? So I can go in and same thing. I can see that here, this pattern is used when adding sugar to the coffee. And the pattern is going to be the optional sugar pattern, and it's going to use the template for added sugar. If I go back over here to the templates, I can look for the one for added sugar. It's right here. And I can see exactly what that looks like. Added sugar. Definition, put sugar in the coffee cup. The verb is added, and the template is added sugar. So that pattern is referencing the template, right? Patterns are created by an ordering of templates. And then the concepts. So the concept, what is a coffee bean, right? So here in xAPI JSON, I can say that the coffee bean is, and then describe the coffee bean. And remember, for any context like that, this is what we call an activity context. So those things, the templates, the patterns, and the concepts. And now what happens out of that? So a couple things. And I'll show you two of them, and then I'll stop. So one is the profile itself. So the profile for doing everything that we're doing here is right here. So I just cut and pasted it. So this is my profile for my coffee training activity. This is the entire thing. And it includes all of the concepts, patterns, and templates necessary. And then what I get out of that, so I'll go back over here and I will run a simulation of that profile. So I'll take the profile that we created, which was coffee training, and the version. Okay. And we're going to say we have two people going through training. They are my trainees. We're going to say that we want them to produce 100 statements as they go through training. And then I'm going to put in the primary pattern, and I'm going to run a simulation. And then when that simulation runs, it might take some time here, but that's all right. When that simulation runs, that will be all the xAPI that represents all of the possible things that occur within this profile. So I think we're right up against time. That is everything you basically need to get started with xAPI profiles. I realize it's a ton of stuff, and I would recommend that you go back and work through the process. So I will hand off and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Shelley. That was great. There is one question in that Q&A pod that I'll let you look at for right now. I've invited Michelle McCrory to the stage, who's going to give us a quick update on Team Rise. So Michelle, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm not sure how to turn on my camera.
Oh. That's okay. Just why don't you just verbally? Okay. There you are. There you are.
Okay, so as you know from last week's summary, we're trying to come up with like a wrapper to implement in Rise to give it better xAPI data. And so what we've worked on this week is publishing the course so that we can get a lot of data instead of just 10. And thank you, Shelley. I am definitely going to rewatch what you said and go through your slides and, figure out all the things that you gave us, because you put it very logically, and I think I can get it now. Also, we would like to invite everyone in the cohort to take our course. We have posted the link in the Slack channel, and we're trying to get as much data as we can, as many statements as we can, so we can get to see if what we're doing is working.
I think you posted that in the hashtag social, if I'm not mistaken. I think Becky posted it there. Yep. So if you go to the hashtag social channel, you'll see that course that you can take and give them some ideas. So I've also invited someone else to the stage here, who is going to give Evan, who's going to give us a team update. So Evan, tell us your team and tell us what the update is.
Hey, I'm Evan. Hello, everyone. I'm on Team ChatGPT, and everyone is welcome. If you want to come and join, lurk, please, by all means, do. But our team started with the premise of we thought it might be cool to experiment with ChatGPT as part of this project. And we didn't really know what that meant because none of us had used it before. So far, we've done a lot of experimentation with exactly what it's good for. For example, we found out ChatGPT doesn't really do math or arithmetic at all. It's terrible at it, in fact. Where we've finally landed and settled is thinking about the process of writing assessment questions. And anyone who's done that knows that it's laborious and often not done well. And so we wanted to try and use ChatGPT to help refine especially distractor options in questions. And then where we now want to start building in and actually using xAPI somehow, since that seems like an important part of this project, is having a course where we're getting kind of feedback from the learner on how it's going, and collecting yes, things are, it's giving ChatGPT is giving me, better, worse, whatever, types of responses, improving based on a scoring rubric, the quality of the possible responses. So that's as far as we've gotten. We have a long way to go. Yeah, the more the merrier, if any of that sounded remotely interesting.
Thanks so much, Evan. That was great. We have a number of other teams too who could not be here and give their own kind of summary. So I'm just going to go really quickly. So there is a just getting started team storyline spring 23. They're just getting started and creating building a visual dashboard from data sent from a storyline course. And there is also Spring 23 Twine. They're just getting started. They have a Twine project. And I also dropped a hashtag discuss. Oh, I haven't dropped it yet. So let me go ahead and drop that really quick. Hashtag discuss AI and xAPI. One of our members here put some prompts into ChatGPT for xAPI, and they're very interesting. So please check them out. Evan's team is hashtag team. Let me just type that in there. Hashtag team dash chat GPT. So that's where their team is located. If you want, just go to the browse channels, click the down arrow. I think it's like search channels or something. And then at the search bar, because there's so many channels in there, some are archived, put in hashtag team, and that'll bring up the ones and sort them by most recent. And then that'll bring up the ones with activity that you can go look at and see what people have done. Also, if you have a team, put that into the hashtag main, because everyone gets the hashtag main in the Slack workspace. Put your team in there, put 1 or 2 sentences, have people come join you. We're here to be for your xAPI journey. If you don't have a project completed, that's fine. Just work on something, learn how to do some things. I know a lot of people are going to be looking at the session today several times. I know we've gone over time, so thank you so much, everyone. But I have something on there. If you would like to give a 1 or 2 minute summary of your team, get more people on, please send me an email by Wednesday, 5 p.m. ET to get on the program for Thursday. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks so much to Shelley for that great presentation that we're all going to watch and watch and watch. And it will be available here in the platform almost immediately. Stay logged into the platform if you'd like. We have tables in the lounge where you can discuss your projects. That is available 365, 24/7. You will also be able to see the recordings if you go to the schedule, go to the day, and then you'll be able to see the recording unedited and raw. So have fun, everybody, and post stuff in Slack. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.